I once led a trip to the top of Mountain Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I laid there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A coworker and I head out in the general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child's stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for these teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I notice a bit of shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close by to the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. The scariest experience I had as a backcountry park ranger was being stalked by a cougar for a day and a half. I was hiking up an unpopular trail up to an old shelter and had that creepy, being watched feeling. I had seen fairly fresh cougar scratches and droppings along the trail, but that's pretty common up here, so I wasn't worried at all. That night I camped at the shelter, which only had 3 walls and a roof. I felt uneasy all night and hardly slept. At one point, chiding myself for being paranoid, I arranged my emergency foil tarp around my sleeping bag so at least I could hopefully hear something if it approached me as I slept. The next day I found fresh droppings, and scratches on the trail I had hiked in on. About a mile past the shelter, I found a mostly eaten deer in some dense brush off the trail. Cougars often keep deceased prey stashes throughout their territory for later snacking. Now, a cougar won't usually tangle with a human, but here I'm a 5-foot tall, 100-pound sack of flesh and bones at least 13 miles out from any other humans. I decided to cut short my 3-day trip and hot-footed it out of there. The last 2 hours of hiking through dusk in a dense forest was the most hair-raising hike I've ever had. I didn't know I was capable of being that hyper-vigilant. The oddest thing, that is my unsolved mystery, was the abandoned camp next to the trail. I was surprised as all get out to walk around the corner one day and find a tent set up directly next to the trail. The trail ran along a nice stream and was a very tranquil spot. Inside, I found a cloth sleeping bag, some dirty clothes, lots of food, big cans of spaghetti, and what looked like some leftovers from a refried beans and rice dinner, and a teddy bear. Everything reeked of cigarette smoke. I was reticent to confiscate everything and leave the individual out there with nothing, but I did take all the food and pack it to a secure food storage box along the way back to my cabin. I left a note explaining where I had taken the food and that they needed to move camp. I was unable to return to the tent for 2 weeks, way too long to leave it sitting there, next to the trail. It was basically untouched when I returned. Some trail crew folks had checked it out and let me know, but that was probably it. I packed up the rest and hauled it out. I spent some time poking around the area, but never saw any other signs of life. It was obviously someone who was not prepared for camping out in the backcountry, judging by the food, equipment, and the teddy bear. I just don't know. Everything, clothing, gear, and other things, indicated just one individual. We're in the middle of nowhere. No other humans for at least 40 kilometers, and we're hearing this unearthly shrieking sound. We run out into the forest, heading downhill to the lowlands next to the river, and watched as a group of maybe 6 wolves chased down a bull moose. The animal had a massive gash in its side. It had been gored by yet another predator which was following up from the rear. A full-grown male grizzly bear. I thought I was watching a movie, like one of those things you only see in nature documentaries. We followed from a distance of maybe 250 meters. While the bull moose desperately tried to cross the river, it didn't make it. The wolves descended on their prey, dragging it onto shore while it was still kicking and shrieking in agony. The wolves didn't get their prize for long as the grizzly was done watching and charged the pack of wolves, which broke up at the first charge, then attacked. The massive bear broke 2 of the pack against the ground. Then the others slinked back into the woods. They didn't go far from the prey remains, knowing the bear would have its fill, and they would have theirs sooner or later. It was a battle that you only hear about from First Nations. That was the moment I realized why we were not the top of the food chain at that moment. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance. Perfectly intact. This is weird because I have seen wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains, with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This wasn't any of those things. The head was completely uneaten eyes, tongue, everything intact. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus, why leave it in the trail? Whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the path.